All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and teach you all about how middleware works in Express.js. Keep in mind that middleware can be defined differently in different environments, but in the general sense, it really just means one thing, and that means it's just a middle process between one or two or many different functions or other processes. So in the context of Express.js, a middleware is just a function that can have logic, but the middleware function also is a request handler as well. So that middleware function has the request response arguments as well. And you can actually use the middleware function to return a response if you want to. So I'll show you a simple example of what a middleware function could look like. So I'll create a simple function. I'll call this logging middleware. And remember, this middleware function will have access to the request and response objects as arguments. Okay? And additionally, the middleware function or the request handler function also has access to this next argument, which is a function that you call when you are done with the middleware. Okay? So what I'll do in this simple example is I'll console log two things. I will console log the request method, and then I'll console log the request URL. Okay? And then once I'm done with logging that to the console, I'm just going to call next, and that's it. In order to now use my middleware, there's two ways. I can enable it globally, so all of my routes will have this middleware be invoked right before its request handler is called, or I can enable it for each specific endpoint. So I'll show you both examples. So let's call app.use to register our middleware globally. So all I do is I just pass in logging middleware as a function or as an argument like this. Okay. Now, if I were to go into, let's say, my browser, if I visit the base URL of our application, you can see that in the console, it now logs the request type, so gets, it logs gets and then the URL that we're trying to visit. If I go to /API/users, it will go ahead and log that as well. If I were to make any request to any endpoint, it's going to log that. Okay, so it is enabled globally. If I only want this middleware to occur for only certain endpoints, so instead of logging it globally, or instead of registering globally, I want to take this middleware. Let's say I only want to do it for this base URL. So what I can do is I can pass that middleware function as an argument like this. Okay, so now if I go back to, let's just go to /API/users, and you'll see that nothing is being logged. However, the moment I go to the base URL and make a request there, it logs it to the console, so that is good. Now, one more thing to mention is that you don't even need to assign it to a variable and pass it in like this. You could just pass it in like this if you really wanted to, and then pass in the arguments, request, response, next. Okay, now one thing to mention is that if you don't have the next function and if you don't call it, it's not going to go ahead and call the next middleware. So in this situation right over here, I have two middleware functions. Let's call this one middleware A. Okay, middleware A will be called first, and then after middleware A is called, it has the option, notice how I said option, to call the next middleware. The reason why I say it has the option is because in this middleware, you can control the request and send back the response if you need to. So this allows you to write additional logic that you can reuse for different endpoints that might share that same logic. And let's say, for example, if the incoming request is missing some kind of authorization token, you don't want to continue to the next middleware or the next request handler. So you want to reject that request by sending back maybe like a status code of 401. Okay, so for example, what I'll do is I'll just simply log base URL, and I'm not going to call the next function. Now watch what happens. If I refresh, you'll see how it is stuck in this pending state. And it does log base URL, but the client never receives a response back. That's because we're not calling the next function. So you need to make sure you call the next function in order for it to call the next middleware down the chain. Okay, you can have as many middlewares as you want called in sequential order. So I can even add 2 more like this. And then I'll just call next after each one. And if I refresh, and if I look at the logs, you can see every single middleware was called. And let me add 1, 2, and 3. So you can see that it is called in sequential order. Base URL 1, 2, and 3, all being logged in sequential order. So hopefully that makes sense. Another thing that I also want to mention is middleware must be registered before a route if you're using app.use to register it. So what I mean by that is if you want a middleware to be registered for all of your routes, you need to make sure that you call app.use right before you call, app.get, app.post, app.put, etc. Okay? If you were to register the middleware, let's say after you called those app.post and app.get methods, your middleware is not going to be registered for those routes. So order matters in this case. So I'll show you an example. Let's say I'm going to go after /API/users. I'm going to go ahead and call app.use right over here on line 44 and pass in the logging middleware. So what I'm doing is I'm registering the middleware for all of the endpoints that are registered after I'm calling this app.use. So these 2 endpoints right over here will not have the logging middleware registered. So I go into the browser, and if I go to the base URL, you'll see that the console does not log anything. If I go to /users or /API/users, you'll see that the console doesn't log anything. But if I were to go ahead and make a post request or a get request to this endpoint, so let's make a get request to /API/users/1, you will see that it now logs in the console the request type or the request method and the URL. Okay, so remember, order matters. And one more thing that I do want to talk about is in the app.use method call, you can also pass in as many middlewares as you want, and they will also be called in sequential order as well. So just one more quick example, I'll pass in another middleware function, and I'll just write a console log and I'll say finished logging, and I'll call next, and let me refresh, and you should see that it says so at first it logs the first thing, which comes from the logging middleware, and then once that middleware is done, it calls the next middleware, okay, and then it logs finished logging. And now once we are done with this next middleware, remember we call the next function, and then it'll just go down to the endpoint level. So remember, the request and response handler is also a middleware as well. So it also takes in the next function, and then you can also call next in here as well. But if you don't have any additional middlewares after it, then there's no point to add that argument in the function signature. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's go ahead and take what we just learned and put it into work. So what I'll do is, since I have a lot of reusable logic for a lot of my endpoints, so notice how in this app.put endpoint, I have a lot of the same logic right over here that is written in the app.patch method and the app.delete method. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this right over here, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to go ahead and create a function up top over here, and I'll call this handle user by ID, or maybe I should call it resolve user by ID. Okay, because the goal of this logic is to really get that index by the user ID. So maybe I should call this resolve index by user ID. Yeah, let me call it this instead. Okay, so this will be an arrow function. I'm going to paste the logic in here. And remember, because it is a middleware, and a middleware is also a request handler, we have the request, response, and we need the next argument as well. So 3 arguments altogether. And now here's the thing though. What I want to do is I want to use this middleware right before let's see. I want to use this middleware right before I call this request handler. Because remember, this middleware that I'm creating right now, the purpose of this is to grab that user index where it is located in the mock users, and we want to be able to have the next middleware that is called use it. But in order for the next middleware to actually be able to use that information, we need to be able to pass it somehow. Now, there's no direct way to passing data from one middleware to the other, but what you can do is you can attach properties to the request object. Since we're using JavaScript, we can dynamically attach properties very easily to the object. So I can reference request, and I'm going to go ahead and reference find user index. So this obviously does not exist on the request object, but I'm just going to assign it to this, just like that. Okay, so now in the next middleware, and all of the succeeding middlewares that are being called, assuming that we don't ever delete find user index from the request object, they will have access to this find user index property, which is going to be a numeric value. So once we are done, we're just going to call next. Okay, and now one more thing that I also did not mention is that next actually does take an argument, but it expects an error object or null. So if you do pass an error object or an error instance, such as like this, like new error, this will actually throw an error at the express level. If you don't pass in anything, then it won't throw any error at all, and it will just assume that everything is successful. Okay, but we are handling errors though with these checks and sending back the correct status based on whatever data that we send to the server. So we should be fine. Okay, and since we're not referencing the request body in this middleware at all, because we actually reference the request body at the final request handler function, we're just going to remove the structure of the request body right there. So let's actually use this for one of our endpoints first, just so you all can see how this works. So what I'll do is I'll use it for my put request to update the user by ID. So we just pretty much take that middleware and we pass it as an argument right before our final request handler, which is this request and response, handler over here. Now, since all the logic that we have inside resolve index by user ID, all this logic that we see over here was moved into that middleware function, so I can just delete all of this. Okay, so I'm going to just remove all of this. I still will need the request body though, so I will remove at least the destructuring of the request params, but I'll leave the destructuring of the request body right over here. And remember, we never modified the request body at all. Now we do need a reference to find user index in this request handler scope, so I will need to destructure that, and I can, now that in the resolve index by user ID middleware function, I got the index and I attached it to the request object. Okay, so at this point, if we hit this part right over here, we can assume that find user index is in fact defined, because if it was not defined, then we actually wouldn't even be in this final middleware at all. Okay, so now I can access find user index from the request object, but now I also need to fix this parsed ID, because that was something from that we had before, but we no longer have that. But that's fine, because I can still reference mock users, use find user index to reference the exact element at the position in the mock user array, and then just simply reference .id like this. Okay, let's go ahead and just test this out before we modify the other endpoints and see how this works. All right, so back into our Thunder client, let's make a put request. So put, and then localhost /API/users. So I guess we'll update user with ID 3, which will be Adam. So let's send the request body. So let's do username. Let's change this to Jackie. So if I click send, everything works fine. If I were to get that user again, the username was updated. And since we didn't provide a display name, that was pretty much just overrided. Okay, so that is working just fine. So let's just update the other endpoints as well. But before, let's just recap of what's going on. So whenever I make a put request to /API/users, and then the route parameter we provide, which was number 3, it's going to go ahead and first call the first middleware. Well, first it will call all of its global middlewares if there are any that are registered before that route. In our case, we only have express.json, which we need to parse that JSON into an actual JSON object. So that is invoked first, obviously. Then we don't have any other global middlewares invoked. So we invoke the resolve index by user ID middleware, and then it will go through this logic. Basically the same thing that we've been doing already, just moved into a separate function. The only difference is that we attach this find user index property, or we add this property to the request object and assign it a value, which is the index of where the user is in the mock users array. And then we call next. So once next is called, it will now call this final request handler, which is also middleware. And then from here, we just simply update the mock users, or update the user in the mock user array. And then we return a status code of 200. That's it. Let's go ahead and update our patch request. Let me just copy this middleware function name, pass that in there. Same thing, just remove that params destructure. I don't need all of this anymore. And then let's see, let's destructure find user index. And I think that's it for patch. Let's just test that out, make sure that patch works. So I'm going to go ahead and update user number 3. So since we restarted the server, the username should be back to Adam, and so the display name be there as well. I'll just update the username using the patch request. There we go. And if I click send, you can see the username was updated. Okay, so the patch request is working good. And of course, if I were to provide an invalid value, the middleware will pick that up for us. You can see it says bad request invalid ID. And that is handled right over, let's see. Should be handled somewhere over here. Oh, you know what? We haven't done it for the get request yet. We'll do that later. Okay, but at least let me do this. If I make a put request to this, you can see that this part gets handled by the middleware for the put request, and same thing for the patch request as well. We get a bad request. If I were to pass in a valid numeric ID, but there's no user with that ID, then it'll just give us a 404, and that is all being handled by the middleware that we just created. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for delete. So let's pass in resolve index by user ID. Let me remove all of this stuff right over here. Yep. And for this part, we just need to grab the find index user, just like that. So that way we know where to splice, or I'm sorry, it's find user index. Okay. Now let's go ahead and try to delete a user. So I'll delete user with ID 3. If I try to get that user, it's not there anymore. Okay, see how user of ID 3 is not here anymore. Okay, let's just go ahead and fix up the last one, which is the get request. So let's see. We need to... So the way that we are actually returning the user in the get request is done differently, because we're using the find method and not find index to actually get the user object itself, and we're just returning that as a response. But what I could do is I could still use the same middleware, resolve index by user ID, and I can grab the find user index value from the request object, and then I could just use that to reference the mock users array to return the correct user. So let's just do that just so that everything is consistent with each other. So let me remove all of this, and I'll go ahead and destructure find user index. And I'll just do this const find user. It's always good to just double check just to make sure, even though we know that find user index does 100% resolve to a user in that array, but it's always good to check just to be safe. So mock users, find user index. And if there's no user, we'll just return the 404. And if there is, we'll just return find user. Okay, so we're still utilizing our middleware for all of our endpoints that we're using the user ID to search or perform operations on. So now if I try to get the user by ID, it says mock users. Oh, let me fix that. I think it's mock. I misspelled that. It's case sensitive. Let's try again. Okay, there we go. So that is pretty much it with middleware. I know it's a lot, but middleware is very powerful, and understanding how it works is very worth it when you're using Express.js, because everything in Express.js that you're going to be using has to do with middleware in some way, shape, or form. So it's good to learn how middleware works, learn the ins and outs of it, and understand how you can use it to your advantage. Okay, so hopefully all of this made sense.